She clocked in at 7 a.m., same as always. She said good morning to the other nurses. She checked the medication cart, reviewed the charts, and smiled. Then she walked into a patient's room and killed them. That happened 6 times before anyone at the hospital filed a report. 6 patients, 6 deaths, and the institution around her stayed quiet. Not because they didn't notice, because noticing felt dangerous. I'm Danny Cruz. I've spent years covering healthcare fraud, nursing home abuse, and hospital cover-ups. I've read thousands of pages of documents that never made headlines. What I'm about to walk you through is not an isolated case. It is a pattern, one that the medical system has had documented for decades and still hasn't fixed. The case begins the way most healthcare serial killer cases begin. Not with a dramatic break, not with a smoking gun in the parking lot. It begins with a number that looks slightly wrong on a spreadsheet. A statistical anomaly. A cluster of unexpected patient deaths on one specific shift, and one name that appears on every chart. In documented cases across the United States and Europe, healthcare serial killers are rarely caught by dramatic detective work. They are caught because someone finally looks at the data. That process takes months, sometimes years. In one of the most studied U.S. cases, a nurse killed dozens of patients across multiple hospitals over 16 years. He was hired repeatedly despite red flags, because hospitals rarely called the previous employer, because the culture of medicine protects the institution first. Let me explain how this works, because understanding the mechanism is how we prevent it. A hospital ward is built on trust. Patients are sedated, unconscious, or too sick to advocate for themselves. They cannot watch what goes into their IV lines. They cannot verify whether the syringe contains what the label says. They rely entirely on the integrity of the person in scrubs standing beside them. That trust is the vulnerability. Insulin is one of the most commonly used weapons in healthcare homicide cases. The reason is clinical and chilling. Insulin is on every ward. It is administered dozens of times per day. A hypoglycemic crisis, a dangerous blood sugar crash, can look like a natural cardiac event, especially in elderly patients or those already in fragile condition. Without a targeted toxicology screen, it does not show up. And targeted toxicology screens are not standard in unexpected deaths. They cost money, they take time, they imply suspicion of staff. So the deaths go uninvestigated. The charts get filed. The families are told their loved one deteriorated suddenly. Nobody lies outright. The truth just never gets examined. The nurse at the center of this case had worked in healthcare for years. She had performance reviews. She had colleagues who liked her. She had patients who trusted her. She was not a loner who raised alarms. She was embedded. She was unremarkable in all the ways that let someone do terrible things in plain sight. What investigators later documented is a pattern of behavior during her shifts. Patients who were stable the previous evening would crash during her watch. Hypoglycemic episodes that required emergency intervention. Some patients stabilized, some did not. In the cases where they did not, the deaths were recorded as natural. No autopsy was ordered for several of them. Because elderly patients in hospitals die, that is considered expected. That is exactly the environment a certain kind of person can exploit. The families notice something. They always do. But what a grieving family notices in the first hours after losing someone is not useful in a court of law. They feel something is wrong. They say the death was too sudden. They say their mother was talking to them the day before. They say she was supposed to come home next week. And the hospital offers condolences and paperwork. That is usually where it ends. It did not end there this time. It did not end because of heroic detective work. It ended because one nurse on the unit started keeping a personal log. She was not officially sanctioned to do that. She just started writing down dates and times and patient outcomes and which staff member was on shift. She did it because something felt wrong, and she had no other tool. What she built over the course of several months was the evidence that eventually cracked the case open. I want to talk about why she had to do that alone, because that is the institutional failure at the center of this story. Every accredited hospital in the United States has protocols for reporting unusual patient outcomes. They have internal risk management departments. They have quality assurance reviews. They have peer review processes that are supposed to flag anomalies before they become patterns. These systems exist on paper. They are audited on paper. In practice, they are often the last line of defense, and the first thing that bends under pressure. The pressure is this: accreditation, reputation, liability. If a hospital internally flags that a nurse may have killed a patient, that flag does not stay internal. It opens an investigation. It triggers documentation. It becomes a legal record. The hospital's lawyers know this. The risk management team knows this. So the internal conversation often stops before it starts. The deaths are reviewed and attributed to natural causes, because attributing them to anything else is operationally catastrophic. That is not a conspiracy. That is institutional self-preservation, and it kills people. In documented cases involving healthcare workers who killed multiple patients, hospital administrators were later asked when they first suspected something was wrong. In almost every case, the answer was months before they reported, sometimes more than a year. They investigated internally. They transferred the employee to another unit. In some cases, they let them resign quietly without flagging the state licensing board. That is how one killer moved across multiple hospitals. Because each institution chose its reputation over the next institution's patients. The nurse in this case did not resign. She kept working, and she kept killing. When investigators finally got involved, they pulled hospital surveillance footage. This is standard procedure, but the amount of footage and the process of reviewing it is staggering. A hospital generates hundreds of hours of footage per day across dozens of cameras. Investigators have to know what they are looking for, and they have to be willing to look. In this case, they looked, and what they found was documented on camera in the medication room, in the hallways, and inside patient rooms, where cameras had recently been installed due to an unrelated safety review. They saw her. They saw her with syringes. They saw the timing. They saw her going into rooms during quiet periods when other staff were at the station. They saw her come out, and they saw the patient decline on the next check. The footage was not a confession. Footage rarely is. But it was enough to build an interrogation around. It was enough to sit across from her, show her specific timestamps, and watch her respond. She laughed. I want you to understand what that means in the context of an interrogation. Detectives who work homicide for years develop a read on how people respond to being confronted with evidence. They have seen denial, rage, tears, dissociation, immediate confession. Laughter is not common. Laughter under these circumstances is studied because it tells investigators something specific about how a person is processing what is happening to them. In documented cases of healthcare serial killers, some showed what researchers call a flat affect, an absence of emotional response that suggested a fundamental disconnect from the reality of what they had done. Others showed anger at being caught, framed as grievance rather than guilt. A small number showed something that looked, genuinely, like amusement. Not because the situation was funny, because they believed, in that moment, that they were smarter than the people in the room. Because they had operated undetected for so long that confrontation felt implausible. She had spent months, maybe years, watching deaths she caused be recorded as natural. She had watched families grieve and accept the explanations she knew were lies. She had watched hospitals process the deaths through their systems without anyone knocking on her door. That history creates a specific kind of confidence, a lethal confidence. And when investigators put footage in front of her, something in her initial response was disbelief that they had actually found it. The laugh didn't last. As investigators walked through the footage, timestamp by timestamp, patient by patient, her demeanor shifted. This is documented in interrogation transcripts from comparable cases. The shift happens when a suspect realizes the volume of what investigators have. It's not the first piece of evidence that breaks someone. It's the realization that the evidence is comprehensive, that there are 6 victims, that there are 6 sets of footage, that investigators have cross-referenced her access to the medication room with the exact windows when each patient's condition changed. The institutional silence that protected her for so long became, in that interrogation room, the thing that destroyed her credibility. Because investigators could show that she had been on shift during every critical event. They could show that no anomalies occurred on shifts she did not work. They could show the pattern that the hospital's own systems had generated and never elevated to law enforcement. And they could ask her, "Why did you do it?" That question is always more complicated than it sounds in a true crime story. People want a clean motive. They want to hear she was angry at the patients, or she needed money, or she had some twisted ideology. Healthcare serial killer cases rarely offer that. In documented cases, researchers have identified a category called angel of death killers. Healthcare workers who claim they were relieving suffering, ending misery, performing a mercy. Charles Cullen, who killed patients across multiple New Jersey and Pennsylvania hospitals over 16 years, described his actions in exactly those terms. He told investigators he was helping patients who were in pain. He administered lethal doses and believed, or claimed to believe, that he was doing something compassionate. The problem with that framing is that it requires us to accept the perpetrator's self-narrative. And in every documented case, the victims chosen were not exclusively suffering, were not exclusively terminal, were not exclusively asking for relief. They were available. They were vulnerable. They were on the ward at the wrong time. The mercy framing is a post hoc rationalization for predatory behavior. It is important to name it correctly. The victims in cases like this are worth pausing on. They were real people. They had discharge dates circled on calendars at home. They had family members who had already started arranging transportation to pick them up. They had medications on their nightstands, prescriptions waiting at the pharmacy, meals planned for the first night back home. They came to that hospital for treatment and received something else entirely. Their families had no way to know what had happened. The paperwork said one thing, the reality was another. That gap between what the institution recorded and what actually occurred is where accountability goes to disappear. I want to explain what those families go through when a case like this finally becomes public, because there is a second wave of grief. There is the original grief, the loss at the hospital, the funeral, the days and weeks of mourning. Then there is the moment, sometimes years later, when they learn the death was not natural, when they learn their family member was killed, when they learn the hospital had information that could have triggered an earlier investigation and chose not to act on it. That second grief is a different kind of damage. It is the discovery that the institution entrusted with protecting their loved one participated, through silence and inaction, in covering the cause of death. Some families pursue civil litigation. Some speak publicly. Some spend years pushing for regulatory reform. In almost every documented case, the families of healthcare homicide victims become some of the most informed, most persistent advocates for systemic change. They have to become experts in hospital accreditation standards, licensing board procedures, state reporting laws. They do it because nobody handed them those tools when they needed them. They built the tools themselves, the same way that nurse built her notebook. In this case, investigators built their file. They worked with prosecutors to establish each of the 6 deaths as homicide. They documented the chain of custody for the footage. They obtained hospital records, medication administration logs, toxicology results where autopsies had been ordered, and the testimony of colleagues, including the nurse who had kept a personal log. That nurse's documentation, unofficial and unsanctioned as it was, became one of the most important pieces of the investigative record. Think about what that means for systemic accountability. The person who ultimately cracked this case was not the hospital's risk management department. It was not internal quality assurance. It was not a licensing board review. It was one nurse with a notebook who felt something was wrong and had no institutional mechanism to report it safely. Because reporting a colleague in a hospital is not simple. It is socially dangerous. In hospital culture, staff who raise concerns about colleagues are frequently viewed as troublemakers. Their own performance reviews can suffer. Their schedules can change. The informal social fabric of a unit is powerful, and it punishes disruption. So the notebook stayed in her bag. The log was personal. She did not walk it to administration because she did not trust what administration would do with it. She kept collecting data while patients kept dying. And when law enforcement finally became involved, she handed over every page. I've covered institutional failures long enough to recognize what makes this pattern so durable. It is not malice at the administrative level. It is structural incentive. Hospitals are rated, ranked, accredited, and sued. Their reputation affects their funding, their patient flow, their staff recruitment. An internal killer is the worst possible headline. So the system builds, entirely unconsciously, a bias toward not finding one, not seeing the pattern, attributing deaths to illness rather than to the person who administered the medication. The institution survives. The patients do not. What does accountability look like after the fact? In this case, the nurse was charged. The evidence was extensive. The footage was clear. The pattern was documented. The prosecution proceeded. But prosecution is not prevention. Prosecution happens after 6 people are dead. What should have happened before any of this? There are documented, evidence-based interventions that healthcare systems in other countries have implemented and that the United States has been resistant to adopt at scale. Mandatory mortality reviews with independent oversight, not internal committees but third-party reviewers who have no stake in the hospital's reputation. Real-time electronic flagging when unexpected patient deteriorations cluster around a specific staff member. Mandatory reporting to licensing boards when a nurse or doctor resigns under investigation. Not optional, not subject to HR discretion, mandatory. Cross-institution data sharing so that a problematic employee cannot simply move hospitals and start over. These are not radical proposals. They are documented best practices. In some states, they exist in partial form. In most of the country, they do not. Because implementing them costs money and creates liability and forces institutions to look at things they would rather not see. The 6 patients who died in this case had families. They had histories. They came into that hospital sick, scared, and trusting. That trust is not a naive mistake. We have no other option. When we are ill, we are dependent on the people around us in a way that makes us fundamentally vulnerable. The social contract of medicine, the entire foundation of what it means to be a healthcare worker, is that you do not exploit that vulnerability. You protect it. She exploited it 6 times and watched the system around her process every death as natural. She laughed in that interrogation room because for a long time, she had reason to believe no one was paying close enough attention to catch her. The footage proved otherwise. But footage is evidence, not prevention. One nurse with a notebook is a hero, but she should not have had to be a hero. She should have had a system she could trust to do what she was doing informally. There is something specific about the way investigators describe the moment when they sit down with a healthcare homicide suspect and begin laying out evidence. The suspect typically enters the room expecting a conversation. They expect to be asked general questions, to give general answers, to maintain the posture they've held for however long the killing continued. They expect to manage the interaction the way they manage the ward, with composure, with familiarity, with the social skills that made them believable for so long. What breaks that posture is specificity. Investigators who have done this before do not ask general questions. They do not say, "We think you may have harmed patients." They say, "On this specific date, at this specific time, this camera recorded you entering this room. At this timestamp, you accessed the medication cart. At this timestamp, the patient's monitoring system recorded a drop in blood glucose. Walk me through that." The specificity removes the room to maneuver. It collapses the space where plausible deniability lives. That is when the laugh became something else. That is when she understood that the footage was not one clip. It was 6, each one with a timestamp, each one cross-referenced to a patient chart, each one part of a pattern she thought was invisible because the institution around her had been treating it as invisible for so long. She had misread the silence. The hospital's silence was not invisibility, it was delay, and delay, eventually, ended. The question investigators always face after a case like this is not just how did she do it? The real question is, how did the institution let her? How did 6 people die before a report was filed? How did she move through that ward, in that building, surrounded by colleagues, for long enough to kill 6 patients? The answer is not that everyone around her was complicit. The answer is that the system was built, piece by piece, to protect itself. And she understood that better than anyone. She is no longer working. She is facing criminal charges. The case moved through the legal system with the weight of the footage and the documented pattern behind it. But somewhere in this country, in hospitals across multiple states, there are wards where the medication logs are not being cross-referenced, where unexpected deaths on one shift are not triggering third-party review, where a nurse with a notebook is keeping her own record because she has no safe way to file a formal report. That is the story I keep telling. Not because the crimes are spectacular, because the systems that allow them are ordinary. I'm Danny Cruz. I don't have a badge. I have documents. And this case, like every healthcare homicide case I have covered, is in those documents, waiting for the institutions to read them honestly. If a case like this is in your city, in your hospital, in your family's history, the footage may exist. The logs may exist. The pattern may already be visible to someone with a notebook who doesn't know who to trust. Pay attention to what's happening in the room when no one else is watching, because the footage eventually gets reviewed. And when it does, laughter doesn't hold up.